part of the aria Visidarte, Tosca's Credo perhaps, from Act 2 of Puccini's opera. It's one of Maria Callas' finest recordings, made in Milan in 1953 with Victor de Sabata, conducted in the forces of La Scala. And the centenary of Callas' birth falls on December the 2nd. She died all too young, aged 53, in 1977. Welcome to this Warner Classics Icons podcast produced by Gramophone. I'm James Jolly and I'm delighted to be joined by Richard Fairman, a regular contributor to Gramophone, as well as to the Financial Times.
Well, in preparation for this, I went to watch the newly colourised film of Callas's 1958 Paris concert. So she sings some of the key roles. She sings Norma, she sings the Trovatore Leonora, she sings Rosina from Barbieris di Siviglia, and then we get the whole of Act 2 of Tosca playing opposite Tito Gobbi, one of her sort of mentors, colleagues, and one of the artists who I think probably really inspired her. But I mean, Tosca was quite significant for her as a role.
It was. It was not only one of the roles she sang most often, it was really where she started her career after initial student roles. She sang amazingly a run of 20 performances of Tosca in Athens at the age of 18. Can you imagine that?
I mean, usually when one goes to the opera, you think, gosh, they're a little bit old for these roles. And actually, it's quite unusual where you'd be saying, I think they're a little bit young.
Yeah, and of course, then it was the opera that was her last performance on stage. So it was with her right the way through.
And it was one of the few operas she recorded twice as well, wasn't it?
Indeed. I guess the first one, of course, was mono and the second stereo. So they made it again. And both have their advantages. The first one is more confident and maybe gutsy, and the second one a bit more subtle and beginnings of some vocal issues. But they're both worth seeing. And the second, incidentally, I believe, was intended as the soundtrack of a film that never got made.
Now, I mean, just to sort of put a bit of perspective on this, I mean, obviously, Callas, we're celebrating, basically her 100th birthday. She was born in New York. Then at the age of 15, she emigrated to Greece with her mother, where she started her first vocal training with Maria Trivella at the Greek National Conservatory. And at that point, there was a suggestion that Callas might have been a contralto, and it was Trivella who basically said, no, you're not a contralto, you're a dramatic soprano. And then she moved across, and this is probably one of the most significant teacher-pupil relationships in her entire life, was Elvira di Hidalgo, Spanish coloratura soprano, who basically gave her the technique that would provide the foundations for her career. Well, let's talk a little bit first about the voice. I mean, it's quite unusual because it encompasses so many, as it were, in different voices within it.
It does. And I think, other people may not agree with me, but I've always felt it's important to remember that she is not a typical Italian soprano. She's not from that tradition. She's something from outside. She's a rare bird. In her interviews with Hidalgo, which was shown recently on television, Hidalgo reminisces that Callas's Italian was not good when they met. And her voice is not Italian either. If you think of a typical Italian soprano like Tebaldi or Freni, they have one colour. And they use that colour and they use the words to make their dramatic effects, and they have a perfect sense of line. Now, Hidalgo taught Callas a line and the Italian style, and of course Callas's Italian language got better and better as she sang it more, but she never had the archetypal Italian voice. She had this great range of colours that she could call on, which made her something very special and very different, which is perhaps why some Italians preferred Tebaldi. They could hear the Italian soprano they knew and loved.
And Tebaldi's voice is more obviously beautiful in sound production. I mean, Callas it's a strange voice. It's not an immediately beautiful voice at all. It's kind of the beauty comes from what she does with the voice.
Indeed, you never know what's coming next. And that's both from role to role, because she changes the colours from one role to the next, which was a very creative idea at the time. How many other singers either thought of doing it or could do it if they'd thought of it? But also within roles, colours change. So as Madame Butterfly, if you listen to the recording of that, she starts in one voice as a young girl and ends up in a more tragic voice as a woman who's had the experiences that Butterfly has had.
Hidalgo was obviously tremendously important in, as it were, laying down the technique. I mean, another very important person in her life musically was Tullio Serafin.
And this is where the Italian style is really hammered into place, I think. With all his years of experience, he was able to make sure that she was going to sing her Bellini Puritani, which is where they began together in bel canto, with the right sense of Italian line, the right weight to the words, all the absolute essentials for singing bel canto.
What is extraordinary about that first encounter is that she was in Venice in 1949 singing Brunhilde in Die Walküre, and the Elvira for Puritani dropped out. And basically she learnt that role in record quick time and was basically performing Brunhilde and Elvira together, which is absolutely incredible.
And what was she doing singing Brunhilde in her early 20s? There's another question.
Well, I mean, she used to sing, I mean, you know, she sang Beethoven's Leonora and Supe Boccaccio. I mean, an extraordinary range of repertoire. We talked about Serafin. I mean, one recording she made with Serafin conducting was Norma, which was an incredibly important role for her. And, you know, obviously Casta Diva, it was almost her sort of party piece. I mean, Norma was something very special. I mean, she kind of almost put that opera back on the map as a really major dramatic work.
And it was because she, more than anybody else, if you compare her with the generations before, had everything the role seemed to ask for. She had not only the ability to sing the bel canto style well, she had not only the top notes, which were still very good at that time, she also had the lower register, which is so important in Norma. In the final act, it's almost all down there, the important stuff. But she also had all the colours and the dramatic sense to give you a complete character. And I'm sure she realised this was the role in which she really gave the complete Callas to the audiences, and probably for that reason, that is the role she sang the most.
One of the great things about Callas is that there are actually a phenomenal number of recordings of her. And I mean commercial recordings. There's a ton, of course, of pirates. But actually the commercial recordings are spaced very nicely through her prime, which I guess is the 50s, really. And obviously, you know, some quality-wise. And I said there are sort of pirate recordings. They're one of the earliest recordings, which shows her off really how extraordinary she was, you know, as a young artist, is Verdi's I Vespri Siciliani with no less than Erich Kleiber conducting.
Yes, I've chosen an extract from this because I wanted us to hear just how complete an artist she was so early in her career. This is only 1951, so she is aged 28. She has not only a voice that can encompass everything that demands, which is to say it starts with a very delicate, slow cantilena. Then she has a recitative in which she fires up the populace around her to revolt, and her mastery of the stage is complete. And then she flies off into a cabaletta. How many other singers could do that at all in that space of time, let alone do it in their 20s? If I went to a singing competition and heard a young singer aged 28 come out and do that, I would be open-mouthed.
It is extraordinary because when you read about her attitude, as it were, as a student, she would be the first there, the last to leave, and she would listen to everybody, regardless of their voice type, tenors, baritones, basses, and just kind of soak it in. So in a way, it was kind of all in there, ready to come out.
I'm inclined to think they should have been listening to her, to be honest.
We talked about the ranges her voice could encompass. And if you look at certain roles, there's the sort of the lyric soprano, there's the dramatic soprano, there's the coloratura soprano, and there's probably more. I mean, it's quite difficult to think of another singer whose repertoire encompassed such an extraordinary range. I mean, probably someone like Montserrat Caballé is the only one I could think of who could go from a Mozart role at one end to Turandot at the other with, things like sort of Carmen along the way. I mean, that was extraordinary about Callas.
It was, but what for me is even more extraordinary is how good she was at each of them. When she sang slow music, she made it expressive in every single line. When she sang fast music, coloratura, it absolutely sparkled. When she was singing dramatic music, you knew what that character was feeling on every single line. So she got more out of each of those than anybody else.
A role like Adriana Lecouvreur, where, verismo in style. So the temptation is just to make a beautiful sound and let the orchestra kind of do the rest. But actually, she brings it absolutely to life.
She does. And I remember the first time I heard that, which is far longer ago than I'd like to admit, I went off and played Renata Scotto in the same aria straight away. And Scotto, marvellous in her own way. She is, of course, another archetypal Italian soprano who works with the words and gives us full verismo. But Callas finds something else. She finds inwardness and humility, and suddenly the aria means something else.
The extraordinary thing is the way she could sing coloratura, because when you look at the repertoire, you wouldn't think an artist would necessarily be interested or capable of sending fireworks up into the sky. But she sort of maintained that ability. I mean, even, listening to this Paris recital the other day at 1958, in Una voce poco fa, she could do sort of amazing things. But I mean, Lacme calls for something a little bit more than, just the sort of standard popping up top every so often. I mean, this is really a kind of volley of notes.
It is, and of course the extraordinary thing is that how many singers with a voice as big as hers could do that? Right at the beginning, she was singing Brunhilde, but she could sing Puritani, and she sang roles as unlikely as Constanza in Seraglio at La Scala, quite near the beginning. Voices of that size really didn't do that. And in Lacme, we hear not only the flexibility she's got, the speed she can put on, but the delicacy that she can do it with.
And there is character behind there, because, I mean, too often it can be a kind of exercise in sort of canary fancying. It can just see what I can do, and that's as far as it goes, and you're wowed by that. But this is actually flesh and blood.
I think she said that was what Seraphine taught her, that every single phrase had to express something. You almost hear Walter Legg there talking to Elizabeth Schwarzkopf saying the same thing. So when Callas came to make recordings with Walter Legg, I'm sure he found a sort of fellow traveller in how to perform opera.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure the working technique was... It was funny, I was talking to Semyon Bychkov the other day, and he remembered that story that when Karajan sat in on a session where Legg was coaching Schwarzkopf, he just left the room and he just couldn't cope with it. He said it's too much. But I mean, that was real kind of forensic attention to detail and, all the nuts and bolts. I mean, some people find it too much, but I mean, clearly with an artist like Callas, it worked amazingly.
Indeed, and we're going to hear an aria from Macbeth that shows us that.
Macbeth is one of those Verdi roles that, you need to be a great vocal actress as well as a singer. I mean, there's more almost behind the notes than the notes themselves in this.
There is, and while you were going to your Paris coloured film, I was watching the interviews on the BBC last weekend, and Callas herself tells a story of recording this track from Macbeth, it's the sleepwalking scene, of how she sang the first take of the piece, and she came off and thought to herself, that was a really good piece of singing. And she said to Waterleg, that was good, wasn't it? And he said, yes, of course, but of course we can't use it. And she said, well, why not? And he said, but you didn't give us a woman who was sleepwalking and fighting with all these random thoughts coming into her mind. And Callas said she immediately saw what he was getting at. She went back and sang it again, completely differently, with every line newly thought out. And that, of course, is what we hear on the final disc.
To imagine that, you know, she was a very grand artist, you know, and did not take criticism kindly, but actually she absorbed everything. She was a good colleague from what one can gather. You know, she loved working with artists, and she would take from people. And if you look at the, you know, the range of conductors she worked with, I mean, she worked really with the best, you know, sort of, you know, Erich Kleiber and Serafin, Karajan, Bernstein, Niccolo Rossini. I mean, you name it, they were all there.
Yes, and I think part of that is, well, a lot of them come from the great performances at La Scala. And I think it's worth saying how enormous a part of her career was La Scala. I did add up how many performances she gave there. I think it's over 120. And there's no other opera house where she gave anything like that number. The Opera House here in London, she did just over 20, I think. At the Met, something like 14. I'm giving rough figures here. So really her career was a La Scala career, and she worked there not only with the great conductors, as you've said, but also with the great directors, Visconti primarily, but Zeffirelli also towards the end. And what she absorbed with them, she must have enjoyed working with people who were so good at their craft. And as you commented earlier, she sat through all the rehearsals with the orchestra. She also sat through the rehearsals with the director working with other singers. So she absorbed everything that they had to say about the opera in question. And it comes out, I think, in her performances. It's very difficult to find a performance, for example, of La Traviata that is more complete in the unanimity of the conductor and the singer than her Traviata with Giulini. And I'm sure this was the case, well, we can hear her Sonnambula with Bernstein as well. So we can hear how detailed her work was with all of them and how they lifted each other to a higher level.
Her Violetta is just an extraordinary creation. As you say, there's the Giulini recording. There's also the Ghione recording from Lisbon. I think I remember when that came out for the first time on LP and was just bowled over. I mean, the sound isn't great, but the performance inside it is incredible.
It is, and I thought we should hear that because the sound is actually better than the Giulini, where the sound is really quite poor. Every Traviata that we have of her live is different, and they go on an ascending scale. So I'm inclined to think the best of all is the last one from the Royal Opera House. The sound on that isn't great either. So we're going to hear her towards the end singing part of the final number before Violetta dies. And we hear how she has chosen a colour of voice specifically for Violetta. I'm sure you're aware of the comment which she made often, which is often repeated, that how pleased she was when one of the critics after the La Scala Traviata said, oh, Callas didn't sound in very good voice at the end. And she said she'd spent months trying to find that colour for illness and fragility. And we hear that even more so in this performance from Lisbon.
One thing we haven't talked about is Callas as a comic actress. Rosina was a role, and I mean, seeing her singing it in that Paris concert. I mean, her timing was so immaculate for that. I mean, she didn't do much comic stuff, it has to be said.
No, I think she probably enjoyed doing it. I believe she said she would have liked to have done a lot more. Her Rosina in Barber of Seville wasn't a huge success at Milan. Some people didn't like it. They felt she was a bit heavy-handed. But Turco in Italia went down pretty well, I think. And think of all the other Rossini operas she could have done, given how good her sort of soprano mezzo area was.
Yeah, and there were quite a few operas where she just sang arias, in recitals. And, one of the loveliest, of course, is Depuis le jour from Charpentier's Louise, which is just, I mean, the aria itself, whoever's singing it is gorgeous, but I mean, to hear Callas do it is quite a treat.
She just delivers that extra bit of magic to it, which is fabulous. I have to say I've loved this since the very first time I heard the album that it came out on, Callas à Paris, the first of 2 volumes. I love almost everything on that disc. One of the problems with Depuis le jour is it ends with one of her most screaming top notes, which she has to hang on to for rather a long while, so we're not going to have exactly that extract. But one thing that I discovered, listening back on some earlier live recordings, is a live performance of her in this aria from some years before. And in fact, the vocal weaknesses, if we can call them that, are already evident. They're not as bad. The idea that she suddenly fell apart in the last years is, I think, not true. I think the vocal issues were perhaps there from the beginning, and when she was singing much less in those final years, I think that probably made them worse. However, this Depuis le jour is total magic.
Now, we started this podcast with a little clip from Vissi d'arte, which is, I lived for art, I lived for love. And it's very tempting with Callas to sort of superimpose the biography and as it were, sort of retrofit her life. And say, oh, yes, but that sums up Callas, the long relationship with Onassis, and then he married, Jackie Kennedy, and, her life fell apart. But it is extraordinary how it does sort of relate to Tosca in some kind of ways, in that almost what she learnt singing Tosca, somehow life caught up with her.
Well, I hope she didn't stab anybody. Of course, you can say that also of some of the other roles. People look at Traviata and they think of Callas as being vulnerable and manipulated by the men in her life. Others might look at Norma and see somebody ferocious and commanding. She was, to those of us who only know her from her music, she was all these things because we know her from those roles.
I mean, one of the other arias that is sensational, that it's one of those sort of standalone things she did, is Suicidio from Ponchielli's La Gioconda, which is just, I mean, she kind of tears up in that aria.
Yeah, I mean, who else has ever been as good as that? We may not see the opera very often, but if we had a soprano in it like her, I think it would become quite a success, because it is really quite a big role, and this is the most fabulous aria that encapsulates what it's about.
If one looks back over her career, arguably the genre that she did so much to bring back to life and make people take seriously was the bel canto repertoire. And of course, I mean, you could argue that Luchia was one of her most important roles, and all equally important for the opera, because she made people sit up and think, wow, this is actually a serious dramatic piece rather than an excuse for sopranos to show off their vocal technique. I mean, she was an extraordinary Luchia.
She was. And there's no doubt that the Lucias before her were quite light voices, very agile. It was all about the coloratura. Indeed, Donizetti's first Lucia was in that vein, I believe. What Callas brought to it, of course, was a much larger voice, but especially with all these extra colours, which gave it drama and seriousness, and she approached it in that way as a serious drama. So she brought to it a lot that hadn't been found by previous artists in that role. She also introduced a lot of bel canto roles that really had been forgotten, like Anna Bolena and Poliuto. So that was another way of her increasing the size of the repertoire. But now I have a question for you. I was looking back at the list of her roles, going back to the beginning of her career, seeing those Wagner roles, and I asked myself this question: would she have become as famous if she continued down the Wagner route? Because it really isn't so easy for a singer to become world famous singing Wagner. The whole point of Wagner's operas is that they are music dramas in which everybody and everything is subservient to the main drama. And bel canto is the mirror opposite to that. They are about the singer, primarily the soprano. Everything is done to make her shine on stage, whether it's the dramatic situations, the range of the kind of music she can sing, the spectacular coloratura that usually comes at the end just before the final curtain. If you sing that material, you step forwards as a star. And we know that not only from Callas, but from Joan Sutherland afterwards, because she had sung other material before her famous
And even
Lucia.
someone like Birgit Nilsson balanced the Italian repertoire with the Wagner repertoire as well.
She did, but then she wasn't a bel canto singer,
No,
so
that's
she
true.
never got the opportunity to sing these absolute star roles like Lucia and Norma, where you are the opera. And as a result, she didn't really rise to the level of fame that the others did.
Well, let's close with, a bel canto opera, Bellini's La Sonnambula, another of these operas that Callas just brings to life.
This is just her enjoying herself, I think. This is the studio recording, which goes alongside her live performances with Bernstein in a way. It's just so vivacious. She manages to keep the lightness of voice that we hear in so much of her coloratura, and yet there is a sparkle still there. There is an absolute core to the sound. It just fizzes with life.
Music from Bellini's La Sonnambula. Antonino Votto conducted the orchestra of La Scala Milan, and Maria Callas' entire commercial catalogue is available from Warner Classics, who, to mark the centenary of the birth of the great soprano, have gathered together on 131 CDs and 1 DVD that legacy in a set called La Divina, Maria Callas in all her roles. And if you stream your music, all the individual operas and recitals are, of course, also available. Gramophone podcasts are free, but if you enjoy them, then a really great way to support our work is to take out a subscription to Gramophone magazine. Over 13 issues a year, we bring you hundreds of reviews by our expert critics, as well as in-depth articles about the latest classical music releases and the most exciting musicians of the day. And if you head over to gramophone.co.uk/subscribe and enter the code podcast20 in the checkout, you can even get a 20% discount off any subscription package. We really value your support. And consider leaving a review or rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. And do look out for another Gramophone podcast very soon.